So I asked the kids what they have done that they might feel bad about. I've been telling my kids in class stories that I translate in Spanish, so I'll tell them. They got to figure out what it means. One of the worst things I did to my brother, this is probably the worst thing. I know it is because he still talks about it. We once, my cousin and I were on vacation, and we wanted him to play hide and seek, and he wouldn't. And we were like 12. Chris was probably 6. And Nikki said, "If you don't play hide and seek, I'm going to kill myself." It was like a balcony situation like that. So she climbs over the railing. And she's like, "If you don't do it, I'm going to jump." And he's like, "She's not going to do it." So she goes, "Ah!" And then she ran downstairs and laid on the floor and like pretended to die. Which we think is funny now, but Chris did not think it was funny when he was 6. He was quite traumatized. So much so that he still talks about, "Remember that terrible time you tricked me into thinking Nikki died." We all mess up. Every one of us. Some of them are little mess ups. We tell a little white lie. We do some stupid stunt to our brother that hurts his feelings and he carries around the pain the rest of his life, right? Some of us do really bad things to people, whether we do it intentionally or not. We all mess up. We all fall short of the glory of God. And then when we realize what we've done, hopefully, if we're not sociopaths, we feel guilty about it. And some of us have some pretty big things that we've done that we carry guilt about. But many of us, I would say, probably it's a bunch of little things. A lot of parents feel guilty when they spend so much time at work and they come home exhausted and they don't get to spend enough time with their kids. Some of us feel guilty when we realize we've treated a coworker badly. Some of us feel guilty that we maybe aren't the best kids to our parents. Maybe we've let our parents down. Maybe we feel guilty because we did something. We said something bad about somebody, and we realize later, like the hurt that caused that person. We all feel guilty at some point in time or another. Guilt is not from God. Guilt does not come from God. I'm going to tell you a little story of someone in the Bible who felt very guilty, and it happened through the Passion. The Passion is the story of Jesus, basically from Palm Sunday through resurrection. That story is called the Passion of Christ. This story happens in the midst of the Passion. So Jesus had 12 disciples. He had 12 best friends. And they traveled everywhere with him. And one of the first guys he picked up was this guy named Simon Peter. And I love Simon Peter. If you've been watching The Chosen, Simon Peter's intense. And I think he was intense. I think it's probably an accurate description. Simon Peter's the one who walked on the water. Like, he's the one who went after Jesus, I'm with you, whatever, you know. And so they come into town and everyone's all about Jesus. And then they're at the Last Supper. And at the Last Supper, Jesus is trying to prepare them for what's about to come. He's trying to tell them, guys, this is it. I'm about to go away, and you aren't going to see me. And you can't come where I'm going. And Simon Peter's like, "No way, Jesus. I will go wherever you go. I will die for you. I will lay down my life for you. I will never abandon you, no matter what." Because Jesus is telling them about the betrayer. And Simon Peter's like, "I would never betray you, Jesus. I will die for you." And we see that passion in the garden. Jesus, after the Last Supper, they go into the garden. Jesus is praying, and the angry mob, I imagine like pitchforks and stuff, they come to arrest Jesus. And Simon Peter's like, "Oh, no, you will not. You're not taking my Jesus." He pulls out his sword. He cuts off the ear of one of the guards. And Jesus is like, "Hold up, Simon Peter. Thanks, but no thanks." And he puts the guy's ear back on. He reattaches miraculously the guy's ear. What's crazy is when Simon Peter's saying, "Jesus, I would die for you," Jesus says, "Simon Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times before this night is over. By the time the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will have 3 times said you don't know me." And of course, Peter's like, "That'll never happen." Well, if you know anything about the Easter story, it does happen. Jesus is arrested. He is tried. Pontius Pilate is like the judge. Pontius Pilate's like, I don't see anything wrong here. He hasn't done anything that's a crime, but the crowd's like, kill him, kill him, kill him. And Pontius Pilate's like, all right, you guys can kill him. I wash my hands of it. They flay him, they kill him, they hung him up on the cross. And you know who was there at the cross? John and his mom Mary and the other Mary. Where were the rest of the disciples? They weren't there. And just like Jesus predicted, 3 times, Simon Peter says, I don't know that guy. People are like, aren't you one of his friends? I've seen you with him. And Simon Peter's like, no, it wasn't me. He's like, what's that song? Some shady river, wasn't me. He's that. He says, no, I don't know that guy. 3 times. And then the rooster crows. After the 3rd one, immediately it says the rooster crowed. Can you imagine how Peter felt when that rooster crowed? And he realized that his very best friend he had betrayed. 3 times. He said, I don't know that guy. Why wasn't Peter at the crucifixion? I imagine it was because of guilt. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't say why he wasn't there. But if I had just abandoned my best friend, who I said I would go to death for, I imagine it was guilt. He was probably thinking things like, I can't believe that I betrayed my friend. I can't believe I didn't stand up for him. I can't believe I didn't fight harder for him. I can't believe I didn't whatever to change the outcome. Because otherwise he should have been there. Because the best friend should be there through such a terrible time. Even if they can't fix it, he should have been there. But he wasn't. And so when Jesus died, I just think, like, what were Peter's thoughts on Saturday? How devastated must he have been all day Saturday thinking about, I should have, I'm a terrible friend, I'm a liar, I didn't do what I said I would do. Racked with guilt. And so, fortunately for Simon Peter, that's not the end of the story. Jesus came back from the dead. And he's hanging out and they see him here and there. Well, there's this scene where Simon Peter finally gets to talk to Jesus after the one-on-one after the resurrection. It's right here in the story of John. So the disciples are on a boat and they're fishing. And someone sees this guy on the shore and John realizes that guy is Jesus. And so it says, as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him and he jumped in the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. So it wouldn't have taken them long to get into shore, but Peter couldn't wait. And I imagine that's because he was so racked with guilt that he just had to talk to Jesus now. He had to jump and just swim and get to Jesus. He could not wait for them to row ashore. And so he rows ashore. I imagine there was a hug, and they're talking, and the other disciples get to shore, and they're pulling in, they have a meal. And after the meal, finally, Simon Peter really gets a chance to talk to Jesus one-on-one. And this is how it goes. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And a 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt. He's like, God, you keep asking me this. Why do you keep asking me, do you love me? You know that I love you. You know my heart, and you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Jesus could have kicked Simon Peter out of the group. Jesus could have said, you know what, Simon Peter, he could have kind of beaten him up, You said you'd be there for me, and you weren't. He could have made him pay a penance. You know what, Simon Peter? Once you've said, in the Catholic way, once you've said 45 Hail Marys, once you've whatever, then you can be back in the fold. He could have made him pay a price for what he did. But Jesus had just come from the cross, and the whole point of the cross, you guys, we celebrate Easter. Have you ever really thought about why did Jesus have to die? Why did he have to go through all of that? The reason that Jesus had to die and come back is because there was this system of brokenness. There was this system of if you do wrong, you have to pay the price before you can be exonerated. We have that system in our country. You break a law, you have to pay a price, and then you're good. That system was happening in the kingdom as well. And God doesn't like that system. He never liked that system. He didn't want us to have that system. And so God sent Jesus to get rid of that system. Something happened in the spirit realm when Jesus, who was sinless, died. When he paid a price, when he had not committed a crime, it broke the system. So now, those of us who believe in Jesus don't have to play by that rule book anymore. Because we have an accuser. Okay? If you guys have heard of, some people call him Satan, the enemy, whatever. There's this spiritual entity that used to be a part of the kingdom of heaven. He was one of God's archangels, and he was like a tattletale. He's like standing up in heaven going, did you see what Paula just did? Did you see she was mean to somebody? You need to punish her. And there was this system of justice that said, okay, Paula, you got to pay a penalty before you can be back in the good graces. But when Jesus died, when Jesus, who was sinless, was killed, that system went away. That's the whole point of Easter. It's the whole point of the resurrection, of the death and the resurrection. It's Jesus saying, enough. God doesn't want this system anymore. He didn't do it to Peter. He didn't say to Peter, Peter, you got to pay a penalty. You messed up. You got to pay the price. You better bring me 3 doves. We'll sacrifice them and then you're good. Jesus said, no, I took all of that. When Jesus went to the cross, he took every sin of ours. Whether it's a tiny little sin, the tiny little sin of being on your phone when your kids need your attention. The tiny little sin of being a jerk to your coworker. The tiny little sin of not resting and not coming to the Lord when you're supposed to. Or the big sins, murdering somebody. Okay, all of that is counted as sin. And when we come to Jesus, he's like, I took that for you. So if you're carrying around guilt, and some people have a lot of it, some people feel riddled with it all the time, this is what I want you to think about. I want you to imagine a dry erase board. And all of your sins are written on it. When you come to Jesus, you say, Jesus, I messed up. In the old system, he'd say, okay, here's your punishment. You got to pay all these things. But with the new system, Jesus is like, I already paid that. So he just takes his robe and he wipes it clean. Every sin, no matter how big and how small, when you write it on the whiteboard and you come to Jesus and you say, here's my sin, he says, gotcha, paid for it, paid in full. And he wipes it clean. Now, what a lot of us do, it's written on the board, we come to Jesus, he wipes it clean, and we go home and we write it down again. We're like, oh, I still feel bad about that. So we write it on the whiteboard again. And he's like, Stephanie, I already wiped that off. Stop writing things on there that shouldn't be on there. I'm not holding this against you. So who's holding it against me? John was one of those disciples that we talked about, one of Jesus' best friends. He had a dream. It's really whacked out dream. Seriously, the Beatles probably should have written a song about it. And it's called the Book of Revelation. And John shows us what that looked like in the kingdom of heaven. He said, in the dream, this is what John saw. And then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of the brethren has been thrown down. He accuses them before God day and night. So what happens is it's written on your whiteboard, you go to Jesus, he wipes it clean, and then you go home and the accuser's like, let me write that down again. And he tells you to write it down, or he writes it down again. He's that little voice in your head that says, you said sorry, but you still messed up. You said sorry, but you're still a bad parent. You said sorry, but you're still a bad follower of Christ. You said sorry, but you're still a bad person. Write that on that board again. And he makes us write it again. And then Jesus is like, I erased that one. Jesus came so that our whiteboards can be erased. It says right there, the accuser's been thrown down. He's not allowed to go to the courts of heaven. He's not allowed to write on your whiteboard anymore. He has no more access to your whiteboard. And we should not give him access. So when you've been forgiven and you're hearing that little like, oh, you still feel bad about that, you got to remember that's the accuser. That's not Jesus. Jesus died at Calvary so that our whiteboards can stay clean. And it doesn't get written down again. Paul says to his letter of Romans, there is therefore now no condemnation if you're in Jesus Christ. When you say yes to Jesus, actually, I feel like when you say yes to Jesus, your whiteboard's like coated in Teflon, right? Like people go to write and it just doesn't stick. When you are a follower of Christ, your whiteboard is wiped clean. No matter how big or how small the sin, when you say, Jesus, I messed up, he's like, got it. Paid for it. Paid for it on Calvary. It's gone. And God doesn't see that. So if you hear accusation, if you feel guilt, that doesn't come from God. That comes from the enemy. He's the accuser, not Jesus. Jesus died so that we don't have to be accused anymore. So for any of you who are wrestling with guilt and you feel guilty a lot, I actually read a thing once that said that migraines are linked to guilt, which I find interesting. So if you suffer with migraines, might be a conversation for you to have with the Lord. So if you feel a person who often feels guilty, you're someone who is racked with guilt, who you're laying in bed at night and you're just feeling guilty of all the things you didn't do or all the things you didn't do right. I know especially parents, this hits you guys hard because I feel like every parent I talk to is always wondering, did I do it right? Did I handle that right? Am I doing a good enough job? But you're all doing the best you can. So if you feel racked with guilt, I want you to imagine you write it on the whiteboard, the thing you did wrong. You come to Jesus and say, Jesus, I did this thing. I shouldn't have done it. I feel guilty. I feel bad. And imagine Jesus going, he is wiping that slate clean. And you are not allowed to write that back on there. It's like double jeopardy. Okay? You guys know, Margaret knows what I'm talking about. There's a law in the United States of America that says it's called double jeopardy. Once you commit a sin and you've been tried for it, you can't be tried for it again. That happens in the kingdom too. Once you have been wiped clean, God doesn't write it back on there again. The only one who tries to write it back on there and try you again for it is the enemy. So if you are suffering from guilt, if you feel guilty often, take it to Jesus. Tell him you're sorry because you did probably screw up. He will wipe it clean and don't let it get written on that slate again. And all of God's people said, Amen.